Okay, Holland, are you familiar with the term Luddite?
I am, but I didn't know that was how it was pronounced.
Or is it Luddite?
I thought it was pronounced Luddite, but you may be right. It may be Luddite. I've only ever read it.
Well, it depends on phonetically. There's two D's in the middle of that word, so we may have to check the phonetic pronunciation of that word. Anyway, what do you think?
I don't think I'd ever survive as one.
Okay.
I really don't. I mean, I have a computer screen in front of my face all day long. I don't think I could make it.
Well, I really didn't have an exact understanding of the meaning of this word before I started researching for today's episode. I think it's an interesting word. And again, as we have these conversations about the future of words, it is kind of interesting because this term came from this opposition to technology, especially the secret organization of mill workers. Back in the 19th century, they actually destroyed the technology to design these mill products.
Oh, that's crazy.
But that's where that word came from, because they were worried about this rogue machinery taking over the world. And that actually has become a common theme.
I was going to say, that sounds awfully familiar. That's like this morning's headlines or something. Well, there's also movies like Arthur Clarke's 2001, A Space Odyssey, where there's the renegade robot Hal who has these hostile plans. He tries to kill the crew. There's another movie called The Terminator with Skynet's evolution. An apocalyptic rampage. There's The Matrix, of course, one of my favorite movies. I remember seeing that. I was in graduate school when it came out. That has machines simulating life for a final end to the human race and portrays this very grim future for humans if AI takes over. Then you've got sci-fi novels, which I never read. I don't like science fiction at all.
Okay.
But I have heard of Isaac Asimov. I've heard of Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rains. And they don't encourage us to embrace technology, right? They pit humans against technology. Recently, an AI program helped write The Day a Computer Writes a Novel. It was entered into a writing contest for a literary award. It got to the finals. So those who fear artificial intelligence may have some legitimate concern.
Absolutely. And, the term artificial intelligence was first used back in 1956 by John McCarthy. And there has been intrigue throughout history about designing beings that can think, reason, learn, and process data. And the basic idea behind AI involves machines that can think autonomously. And McCarthy described it as getting a computer to do things which, when done by people, are said to involve intelligence.
Do machines really think?
Can
they demonstrate intelligence in the way that you and I are probably using that word?
Well, there's the rub.
Are there reasons to consider ethical limits of AI and how this technology affects human beings? And the question I'm most interested in is, how can stories help us decipher fact from fiction when we start talking about AI and machine learning? And to answer those questions and lots of others, we have two incredibly brilliant guests at the Afterword table, Dr. John Wyatt and Dr. Scott Hawley. Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words. Scott's a physics professor who develops machine learning systems because he wants to help his students at Belmont University prepare for the future. Scott, can you tell us a little more about yourself and what you're working on?
Sure. So a lot of my motivation involves picking problems that might be also of interest to my students. So this tends to involve machine learning applications for signal processing or acoustics to help professionals in the creative industries like producers or composers or audio engineers develop some tools so that they can do their jobs easier, and do a lot of technical work on that side. And then I've also gotten involved somewhat on the discussions of ethical implications of deployment of machine learning systems in society at large.
That sounds like a lot.
Okay, I've already learned things, and all you've done is say what you're doing.
Absolutely. And then we also have Dr. John Wyatt. He is the Emeritus Professor of Neonatal Pediatrics and Ethics at University College London. He's staying up late to talk with us tonight from the UK. He's also a senior researcher at Faraday Institute, Cambridge. And he has so many exciting things that he has investigated and researched. One of the things I think is really interesting is that he pioneered the use of controlled hypothermia for birth-injured babies, which is now a standard treatment used around the world. He is particularly interested in the impact of advancing AI on our understanding of what it means to be human, on human flourishing, and the ethical use of AI in health and social care. And something that sounds rather interesting, companion bots. So welcome, John. Please share some updates on what you're doing currently.
Yes, thanks. It's great to be here. My background is as a clinician working in an intensive care unit with very sick and many, sadly, brain-damaged babies. And so I got very interested in a lot of the ethical challenges as technology advances. And one of the fundamental questions which keeps coming up as technology advances is, what does it mean to be human? And how does technology change our understanding of what it means to be human? And so I've now retired from the frontline clinical work, but I'm very interested in artificial intelligence and robotics and asking this question, how is it changing our understanding of what it means to be human? And these companion bots are a really interesting idea. The idea is there's a terrible epidemic of loneliness around the world, particularly older people. And instead of isolated elderly people being admitted into institutions, the big new idea is to make the home as smart as possible using really advanced technology, but then having a companion bot, a program who's going to be there for you 24/7, always friendly, always interested. And so the question is this a good idea? Is this dehumanizing? Is this a way forward for the human race?
Interesting. Such good questions.
There really is. In fact, I think that's how we first found out about your work.
Yes.
Was through Dr. Jennifer Butte and her interest in dementia. We had her as a guest on the program, and then we followed her, and she was saying something about what you're doing. I said, oh, this sounds interesting. We wanted to do a project on AI, and that's what led us to you, was the companion bots.
And the questions, as you said, the fundamental question about what does it mean to be human, and are we crossing an ethical border by having that in place of a human being?
Okay, we've got an hour to answer that.
Okay, here we go. All right, so John, how did you get involved with AI?
So this is really that following this question, and particularly I'm interested in a kind of fundamental, religious, philosophical questions, because, people have been asking this question, what it means to be human, for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And one of the really interesting things is that you can see how people have used the most advanced technology of the time to try to understand what it means to be human. So back in the medieval period, it was precision clockwork that was the most sophisticated technology. And so then you had these various philosophers and thinkers saying, well, the human must be some kind of clockwork mechanism. The brain is all clockwork. And then you get hydraulics, you get the rise of steam power. And then lo and behold, the human body is basically hydraulics. And it's all tubes and pressures and flows. And then Helmholtz was very interested in the telegraph, and which, telegraphy was just being developed in the early 20th century. So then, well, maybe the central nervous system is like a great telegraph, a great sort of telephone network of wires and cables. But here we are now in the 21st century, and the most advanced technology is the supercomputer. So, well, therefore, human beings must be some kind of supercomputer. We're computers made out of meat, as somebody said.
Machines made out of meat. Wow, that's a very interesting word picture right there. Wow. What about you, Scott? What got you involved with AI?
Well, my background is in doing all kinds of nonlinear modeling problems in physics from a computational standpoint. And I guess it was about 2013, I started seeing machine learning applications in the world of audio. And I knew that this was going to be important for my students, who are mostly audio engineers. And that was when deep learning was all over the news. And so I started studying it just on the side, and I really got into it. I just really loved it. On the technical side, I just love creating things and building things that do cool stuff. And so really on a technical side, I was interested. And then sort of the broader issues of ethics and society, I got interested. A few years ago, there was a grant coming out of Oxford on interdisciplinary studies in science and humanities, and I proposed a study on ethical implications of machine learning models from a Christian theological perspective, and that got me rubbing shoulders with philosophers and historians and psychologists and a lot of neat people. It's really cool to be on this show here with John, because even though John and I haven't met before, we know a lot of the same people, and so that's exciting to me.
Well, wonderful. We're glad that we could bring you all together. This deep learning, talk to me a little bit about that. What do you mean by deep learning?
Yeah, so this was a term that was coined by Geoffrey Hinton, who recently won, essentially, he was one of the winners of the Turing Prize, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize in computer science. So neural networks have been around for a long time, started back in the 40s, let's say. And the idea was kind of based on biological neurons and trying to build computers that could think. And they've kind of gone through these phases of being in fashion and out of fashion. They got out of fashion for quite a while, and people were still working on them, but there was a lot of people who kind of associated neural network research with stigma. And so Hinton coined this new term, deep learning, to say what we're going to do is we're going to have neurons feeding into other neurons in a hierarchical system. We can have layers and layers of neurons, kind of like you would see on an organizational chart for a company. And that we could have a deep network of lots of layers. So deep learning, I know in the education world, they've started saying deep learning is about learning something really deeply. But in machine learning, deep learning just means we're using these neural network systems, which we can talk about greater detail what those are, but we're using a hierarchical structure that's got a lot of layers of neurons to make a deep network.
Excellent. That does clarify, because from an educator's perspective, I was thinking to know something really well. So again, for all of our listeners and our audience out there, we love hearing the future of words and what does this mean and how that intersects with it. So thank you for explaining that.
I think that must be one of those words that sort of captures people's imagination and you make it mean whatever you want it to mean. Deep
Possibly.
learning, there are some certain specific definitions, but when we start talking about it and we throw out that word deep learning or that phrase deep learning. Okay, let's go to storytelling, because our interest is in the place where macro trends intersect with stories and storytelling. And when it comes to AI and machine learning, I think there are lots of stories out there. Scott, can you help us discern the difference between science and science fiction when it comes to the stories about AI? Every time we talk with somebody, we're told that legend and fact overlap in a lot of fields. So I'm guessing that's true for you too.
Yeah, one of the things that I notice most frequently with respect to storytelling with AI is this category or this attribution of anthropomorphism, this idea of creating sentient artificial life forms. And that's something that exists purely in science fiction that is not part of the AI science. I really liked your quote earlier from John McCarthy, where he's highlighting that AI research is generally about creating systems that can perform tasks, tasks that are generally associated with intelligence. It's not about the formation of some kind of personal identity or creating some new, mind on its own. So I see that as a real distinction between most storytelling about AI, which involves anthropomorphism and some new entity that thinks for itself, versus trying to create systems that perform specific tasks that generally we used to think only humans could do.
That is very clarifying.
Yes.
I really appreciate that. What about you, John?
Yes, well, I agree that the stories can be exceedingly confusing. And actually, it's just struck me fairly recently that if you take all the other great industrial revolutions that have taken place, starting with the first industrial revolution and the invention of, the mills and automated machinery and so on, what happened was that the technology happened first, the technological revolution happened first, and then people started writing stories about it. I mean, Dickens wrote stories about, the mills and the industrial revolution. And that's been true for all the revolutions except this one. And for some fascinating thing, people have been writing stories probably for 100 years in advance of the technology. So, it goes all the way back to H.G. Wells, in fact, arguably to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley.
Absolutely.
19th century. And so these stories, and then you've got, as you said, you've got... The term robot was invented in a play in the 1920s. You've got Asimov and a whole generation of writers speculating about what these intelligent devices are going to be. And, and as Scott said, this anthropomorphism where we put our own humanity onto the machines. But I think this must be the first time that a technological revolution has been preceded by decades of storytelling. And it's even more complicated than that, because many of the people, particularly in Silicon Valley, the technical nerds who are driving all this, they are themselves, nearly all of them, they're science fiction gurus. They've been bred in this stuff from their childhood. And some of them say quite explicitly they're trying to make the science fiction come true. I only recently heard that, for instance, Alexa, the voice of Amazon's Alexa,
Yes.
this very sort of calming female voice. Well, apparently that is modeled on the voice of the computer in Star Trek. On Captain's log, there's this, on the bridge, there's always this calm female voice that is. So the creators of Alexa deliberately attempted to recreate something which starts out as fiction. So there's a very complex interaction going on here between the storytelling, which has preceded all this, and then what's actually happening with the technology. And it leads, I think, to a lot of confusion and in particular these very dystopic fears of the machines taking over.
Yeah. I would never have put the two and two together like that every other industrial revolution or technological revolution has happened, and then the stories are written, but this has been flipped. And then if you do have scientists trying to make stories come true, then they're bound and determined to make it happen.
Yeah, and it gets really weird. And of course, this is also where the philosophy comes in, because, there are different understandings, obviously, about what it means to be human. But if you are, again, a technical nerd and you think and you are convinced that the human brain is simply a computer made out of meat, then you say to yourself, well, what's the difference between a computer made out of meat and a computer made out of silicon? And so I would expect my wiring to start doing the same kind of things that computers made out of meat do. So there's a connection between the philosophy and what you would expect an intelligent machine to do.
That's fascinating. So, Scott, what are the legal ramifications to AI and its use in the workplace? Because John just mentioned Alexa, and I'm pretty sure you're the one who posted about a country, I believe it's in Ireland, where a law firm is not allowed to have smart speakers in its offices.
Yeah. So I think we're going to see AI regulation looking very different depending on which country we're talking about. So, for example, United States versus, say, the European Union is much more likely to impose regulation than the United States. And then, of course, China has what people tactfully call a permissive regulatory environment. So, there are a lot of different opinions on this, and they seem to have a lot to do with the national identity. Here in America, people are less inclined to impose regulation than in some other countries. For many years, there's been talk about treating, even before AI, the notion of treating software engineering like other engineering disciplines, like civil engineering or electrical engineering, where people are building products and systems that can have an impact on people, and where practitioners are either licensed or where companies have to demonstrate that they've done their due diligence, in building a bridge and showing that it's not going to fall down. Some people have been saying for a while now, maybe we need to have some similar sort of thing. The phrase that I see, for example, on Twitter is that the burden of proof should be on companies. And I noticed that at the NeurIPS conference, one of the big machine learning conferences, next year, they're going to require a section of every paper is going to be a broader impact statement where people try and at least demonstrate that they're thinking about the larger impact. And it's not quite the same thing as regulation, but this business of trying to force people to really think about the impact of their systems is a important conversation.
That is interesting. Can you give maybe an example of how that system might impact human beings, Scott?
Well, certainly there are going to be regulations regarding data gathering that are out there now. Again, European Union leads the way with their GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which says various things about how you can track people or not track people. They have the right to be forgotten in Germany, for example. And the reason this is relevant for AI is that machine learning systems are built upon data gathering systems. And so building a database, if you're going to have a modern AI system, you're going to be trying to gather as much data as you can on your citizens or your customers or whatever this is. And so regulation regarding data gathering practices are going to directly impact AI systems as well.
That's interesting. What do you think, John?
Yeah, no, this is a huge issue in healthcare. Because obviously health data is particularly personal, and traditionally doctors have put a huge emphasis on the importance of confidentiality and ethically they are maintaining confidentiality because of the potential explosive implications of healthcare information. But as Scott says, there's a huge desire to build up massive databases of health-related information so that this can then be used in the AI systems for analysis. The National Health Service in the UK has about 60 million patients, the entire population of the UK. And so it's seen as a kind of honeypot for healthcare technologists around the world to get their hands on these huge databases of patients, including the genetic information, all the biochemical information, the family information, and so on. So there's some real headaches here, and I, as a doctor, I feel very concerned about these issues. I'm not sure I want my data being analyzed in these systems. You really have to balance the potential risk to the individual against the benefit for the community as a whole.
That's an excellent point.
Wow. 3 things just occurred to me as we're having this conversation.
Okay.
The first was hearkening back to our Smart Cities episode.
Yep.
When we talked about that and how much information is required to run a smart city.
Yep.
So does this mean that these highly regulatory parts of the world are going to have less ability to create smart cities? I mean, will we start seeing more of those rising up in Asia and parts of Latin America and not so much in Europe? Did Europe just kill its ability to do that?
Well, I think that's the real issue. And I think you're right that particularly China, where both in terms of the Communist Party that runs the country and also in terms of the culture, there seems to be much greater acceptance of this kind of wall-to-wall collection of data, surveillance, and so on. Whereas I think Europe is traditionally much more concerned about issues of privacy, confidentiality, and there is going to be some kind of trade-off there. I mean, it's interesting, just this very day on the BBC News, there was a big discussion because the police have started using AI-based face recognition systems on the streets in London. And some privacy organizations have been pushing back and saying, we don't think this is appropriate and it has a significant error rate and all the rest. And then the head of the Metropolitan Police in London has come back and said, yes, but, using this system, we've already identified a whole series of rapists and potential murderers. And would you rather have these people walking the streets of London or would you rather have the surveillance of absolutely everybody? So this is a very live issue.
Absolutely.
It is. Well, yeah, that kind of leads to my second point, which was people say that privacy is really important to them. But in content marketing, so the rule of thumb or the saying is people say they value privacy, but actually what they value is connection. If people valued privacy, they wouldn't go on Facebook and answer 20 questions about my favorite this, that, and the other thing. I mean, people don't value privacy. People think they value privacy.
Well, they value privacy. They think that they value privacy, but as you say, in reality, they don't until it comes back and bites them.
Right.
Right.
which does happen sometimes, and something horrific turns out, as we know, there are incidents that happen with Facebook and so on, which can have devastating consequences. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, I think there's a particular take here in the Christian world, and that is the idea that because we are fallen people, a certain amount of privacy and confidentiality is actually essential to being human. In the Garden of Eden, before the fall, the human beings were naked and unashamed, it said. But as soon as the fall had happened, they had to have clothes.
Right.
They had to, and we can't go back to a sort of pre-fall existence where we just let it all hang out, literally or otherwise. Actually we do need privacy. We need because it's a fallen world.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can add, I think people value privacy, but there are also other competing values as well. One of the big ones being convenience. Convenience. This reminds me, there's a writer named L.M. Zakasis who said, the four horsemen of the digital apocalypse will be called convenience, security, innovation, and lulls. Lulls like doing things for jokes.
All right. Wait a minute, Scott. One more time. Convenience, security,
innovation, and lulz, L-U-L-Z.
Okay.
That's the plural of LOL.
Yeah. This idea of privacy being important to me is true, but it's subordinate to some other things that people also value, certainly, as John pointed out.
Yeah, so true. Okay, so let's think about that now and talk about AI regulation, Scott. Sundar Pichai, the CEO at Google, recently said in the Financial Times, "There is no question in my mind that artificial intelligence needs to be regulated. It's too important not to. The only question is how to approach it." Now, he may want it regulated because he wants to have control.
Kind of what John was saying.
Right. I'm not sure, but what do you think?
Well, I think that in many cases there needs to be a sufficient incentive for businesses to change their practices. And it's not always voluntary. And so in many cases, regulatory impositions have been the stick and maybe even the carrot for effecting change, because people have to ensure compliance with certain regulations. And if those regulations weren't there, I think it's safe to say that a lot less effort would be expended on those sorts of things. So it's interesting to hear Google saying that, in that they're kind of in a good position to suggest the terms on which that regulation occurs. And again, I think it's going to look different in America versus the UK versus Australia is also an interesting example where they have some really strong regulations about certain things, digitally, software distribution and piracy, for example. But then they have this massive drone warfare research park that they've been building. And so you kind of look at that and think, well, it's an interesting combination of values that are different from maybe some other societies.
So how is this going to affect international relations, particularly international development, if we think about low-income countries that have neither the capacity nor perhaps the interest to regulate AI? Is it possible that actors who want to do experiments that they're prevented from doing by regulations in the EU or the UK will just pick up and move to, I'm pulling a name out of the air, Burkina Faso, set up their lab and do whatever they want?
I don't see any reason why that wouldn't occur, unfortunately.
And that upends the way that we think about how the world is currently structured post-World War II, right?
Yeah, I think this is part of the problem with this kind of technology. You know, if you take something like nuclear technology and arms limitation and so on, that by and large has been remarkably successful. The reason is that you need massive amount of engineering in order to build a nuclear bomb, and therefore it's possible for the rest of the world to watch what's going on. Now, when it comes to this kind of technology, you can do it in a lab somewhere completely unobserved. And we know already that there are so-called bad actors around the world who are working away at very malicious software and then using that to attack. So it's a pretty scary prospect, I think, as to how regulation is going to work. Particularly, I think, as some people are thinking that it's going to be increasingly a bipolar world. There's going to be China and its sphere of influence on one side, and then there's going to be the US and its sphere of influence on the other. And it seems that the idea of being able to implement regulation across the world, I think, is probably just not going to happen. So it's a challenge. Having said that, I think this is definitely moving up the agenda in Europe and in the UK and in the US. And I think because the evidence of serious harm that's being done, particularly through social media, but also the worry about how new autonomous vehicles, for instance, might be regulated, and other uses of AI. So I think this is going to be a major issue. I've been involved in some discussions with parliamentarians in the UK, members of parliament, who are very interested in this topic and want to talk about it.
That makes perfect sense.
A much more realistic AI novel then wouldn't be, we built this human-like thing that wants to take over the world. A much more realistic AI novel would be a group of bad actors from pick a place, goes to some small country, pick a place, and creates something that they can give to a massive army or massive military that can specifically target individual people or whatever. There was actually,
I was going to say,
president of Venezuela or Ecuador or someplace actually shot by some smart bullet.
Yeah, but you also just described the Avengers movie, you know. So
I didn't see the Avengers movie.
All right.
You have the last question. I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, so John, what is the essential element we need to know as we consider the words we use and stories we tell and talk about AI?
Well, I think we need to be very careful in thinking about the difference between a metaphor and a description. So when you say that the brain is like a computer, that's a metaphor. And it's quite a useful metaphor. I mean, there are many things that the brain does which is like a computer. And so using that metaphor is a helpful way of thinking about the brain in certain ways. But when you say the brain is a computer, you've actually it's subtly shifted into something which is deeply misleading. And yet that happens all the time. People say, oh, well, the body's just a machine and the brain's a computer, all this kind of stuff. So I think helping people to see the difference between a metaphor and a description is going to be really important.
That's excellent. What about you, Scott?
Well, I really think about The Sorcerer's Apprentice. I'm thinking in terms of the Fantasia story with Disney, where Mickey Mouse, he has this task of hauling water and keeping the place neat. And so to save labor, he automates this task by endowing these brooms with the ability to kind of do the task that he wants. But it kind of gets out of hand. You know, they keep carrying too much water and they're not really paying attention to the broader impact that the scale of this operation is having on the environment. And this actually gets picked up, philosopher Nick Bostrom in his book Superintelligence. He likens it to a machine that's tasked with creating paper clips. And so it ends up ultimately killing all the people and turning the entire Earth into paper clips. And so it's not necessarily, we don't need to have a Terminator. We don't need to have something that talks and that's malevolent. It can simply be an automated system that we don't fully understand the consequences and the scale of it can get out of hand. I think that's an important metaphor as well.
Wow. That's amazing. I have got so many thoughts in my head right now.
I know.
Well, let's wrap this one up.
So join us next week as we continue to talk with Dr. John Wyatt, Emeritus Professor at University College London, and Dr. Scott Hawley, Professor at Belmont University, about the interplay of stories and artificial intelligence. While you wait, please leave us a review, rate us on Apple Podcasts, and become a subscriber to the AfterwordPodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.